1. Throughout my childhood, I was blessed to have my cousins as my next-door neighbors. We lived surrounded by woods and would build forts, look for fish in the creek, find arrowheads, collect antique bottles from a former dump site. Some later ended up being worth a good amount of money. My great childhood all in all. Anyway, one day in the woods we met a kid around our age, walking along the trail. We all introduced ourselves and asked him how old he was and where he was from. He pointed toward the direction opposite of where he came from. He asked to join us as we were building a teepee stick fort. We gladly let him join. My cousins and I were pretty pumped because there weren't any other kids that lived around us. Very much deep in the boonies. Later on when we went home, we all told our parents about our new friend, and how he was going to meet us again tomorrow. Every day for around a month or so, I'd say, we would run into him at the same part of the trail we originally met him, and he would proceed to join us in whatever game or activity we would get into. Until one day he just sort of stopped showing up. A week or so passed, and we are eating lunch at my house, telling my parents how upset we are that our friend isn't coming around. My parents said, well, why don't you guys just make up another imaginary friend? Because we were all around that age of doing so. We continuously tell my parents no, he's not an imaginary friend, and they sort of brush off the conversation to keep from arguing with 3 upset kids. Years later, as adults, during a family Christmas party, the story comes up. We all 3 fully remember the story and the description of the kid, each of us bringing up a game or something we did while the kid was around. My one cousin remembers an exact conversation we had with him, talking about different arrowheads we found in the creek, and showing him the collection we had in our fort. Both of our parents back then figured we were playing with an imaginary friend, because the closest house to us was a home that was, and still is, vacant to this day. By closest house, I mean closest house in walking or bike riding distance. Our parents' homes to this day are surrounded by 4 to 6 miles or so of woods and trails. We decided to do a little research online on the street we live on, and the only house nearby, finding 2 puzzling events that had taken place. First was, we found that on September 4th, 1962, a small commuter plane had crashed in the woods that we played in, killing 13 out of the 13 occupants within it, in which one of the occupants was a 7-year-old boy. The second puzzling find was the family that used to live in the only house near us passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning, in which a mother, 1 young girl, and 1 young boy had died. I would chalk up the occurrence of meeting and hanging out with this kid to a childhood imaginary friend. However, all 3 of us had the exact same experience. My older cousin in this experience is 2 years older than me and his brother, which during this time would make him around 9 or so. He is fully convinced this occurred, and to this day you couldn't tell him otherwise. None of us have an explanation. We are all pretty sane individuals, at least we think, and never struggled with any severe mental illness. My older cousin is a very high-ranking individual in the military. Other cousin is an engineer, and I am currently studying for my master's in neurology and psychology. I am a pretty scientific-based person, and haven't found any psychological or neurological condition to explain a group occurrence like this. The house closest to us, where the individuals died of carbon monoxide, wasn't anywhere near where we ran around in the woods, so we couldn't have been delusional from any type of fume exposure. I'm open to any type of possibility or explanation. I'm not set in stone that it's paranormal. I hope you can provide some positive and respectful dialogue, and I'll be more than happy to engage with it. I am on my break from studying and decided to give this a post. 2. A little while back, probably 8 years or so, I was visiting my aunt and my 2 younger cousins at their house. They lived in an old house next to a trail road that ran through my small town. I say lived because they have since moved out. The house was a nicer old-style home with 3 different levels and very well kept. But with that being said, I always felt a little off or uneasy when I was there. Anyways, it was getting late and my younger cousin was supposed to go upstairs and get ready for bed. He got up and went over to where the stairs met the family room and froze. He would not move. My aunt asked what he was doing, and he responded, "The eyes are looking at me." Being old enough to understand the situation at around 14, I was absolutely terrified. My mom had told me about some of the weird things that would happen to my aunt, and I found it very interesting. This, on the other hand, I did not find interesting. It just wasn't a story this time, it was happening while I was present. My aunt looked at us and quickly ran over to my cousin only to see nothing. She reluctantly went upstairs and put him to bed, came back down, and my mom and I got out of there as soon as we could say goodbye. Later, the next day, I heard my mom talking with my aunt about what happened, and I asked about it when she got off the phone. She said that later that night she heard my two cousins talking to each other, so she went in to tell them to go to sleep because it was way too late to be keeping each other awake. When she went into the room, she found my oldest cousin fast asleep on the bottom bunk, and the younger one wide awake on the top. She asked why he was talking, and he said that the lady in the white dress is keeping him awake and won't go to sleep. This shook my aunt up pretty good, and so she slept with them on the bottom bunk until they all fell asleep. Kudos to her, because I would have been out of there and on Zillow the next day. Early that next day, she was making the kids breakfast in the kitchen, with one of my cousins while the other was watching TV in the living room. All of a sudden, my younger cousin came flying into the kitchen looking pale as a ghost, no pun intended, and crouched down behind her. He said that the lady in white was walking down the stairs and he wouldn't leave her side until they left for school and whatnot. A few weeks later, my uncle, who was very closed-minded to the paranormal, went down to the basement to get his hunting gear around for the next morning. To his surprise, his gear had been organized like he always kept it on the other side of the room. He knew that no one had moved it because they kept it locked due to the fact that there were guns down there, and they had 2 young children. He asked my aunt if she had maybe moved the items, but she claimed to not have been down there in weeks. After making him somewhat open to the idea of something weird going on, he expressed something else. He always kept cans of chew in his bedroom dresser, and one morning they both woke up, and the cans were stacked on top of each other, on top of his dresser. Both my aunt and uncle claimed to not have touched them, and my cousins were too young to know what chew even was, so this was alarming. I was close with my uncle, and at a family gathering I asked him what he thought about everything that had been happening. He said that he had no way of explaining the things that had happened, and he was now a believer. This completely sold me on the fact that something was definitely going on inside of that house. Over the next year or so, many more odd things happened, and they decided that they were going to move out a year after all this started happening, and took a bunch of pictures of the house to post online. When they were going through them and getting ready to post them, they noticed a bunch of little white orbs in some of the pictures. They showed the family these pictures, and I can, without a doubt, say they were not dust particles or any kind of camera issue. Hopefully this was worth a listen, and I would love to hear your thoughts. 3. Me and my mom moved to this innocent-looking small and weirdly pink house. It was a duplex, and the whole neighborhood was really nice and quiet. House was probably built before World War II. Strange things started to happen about 5 months after we moved in, at least to me. First pipes, radiators, sinks started leaking. Water was literally coming from the floor of the basement from under the bathtub. From the roof, and even from the walls in some parts. It was a newly renovated home, but since some mistakes can happen, we called my father, he is a plumber, so he could evaluate the situation. He couldn't explain what was going on, but tried to fix the radiator, sink, and bathtub. At this point, we were thinking that there was some construction problems in the basement, and maybe because the home was old, we should call some other specialist, and we did. At this point, I started to experience this foul smell waking me up in the middle of the night. Smell that reminded me of an animal of some sort. I was feeling watched at these instances, and after a while was even experiencing this feeling of something sitting on top of me. I was studying psychology at that time, so I was almost 100% sure that this was sleep paralysis, and I tried to stay calm and not worry too much, even if I was sure that this is not normal. There were many situations when I was hearing noises from the attic, and felt that I was being touched, but I was always blaming it on my imagination. We were often fighting that I leave doors to the porch open. You see, they had this tendency to stay open, even when I made sure to close them by the key, and checking the handle to be super sure. My mom was a bit obsessed about those doors, and now I know why. 2 years have passed, and my grandmother and her man were visiting, so I was sleeping with my mom in the same room, and grandparents in her bedroom on the first floor. I was awoken by a noise from the kitchen, and decided that I'd go to the bathroom since I was awake. Passing the stairway, I saw the light and heard noises from someone making tea or something in the kitchen. When I come back to my room, Mom asked me, "I can't sleep or what?" I said probably and went to bed. In the morning, when we were eating breakfast, Mom asked them why they were so loud at night, and they obviously stated, "We thought it was you." At that point, my mom said, "Oh, so ghosts again?" This was so random because we haven't spoken about it ever. She said that she experienced some messed up stuff here, and that she even called 2 exorcists. The first one helped for about a week, and second for half of a year. I was shocked since my mom was always so skeptical and was almost making fun of paranormal stuff. That changed. I went upstairs having my fun with the attic dweller, and she had her burglar coming from the basement. She was even sleeping with a knife for a while. Besides the doors opening randomly, we had this intercom that wasn't working. We were sure that it's out because the cable was cut and visible. So we had to go to the garden gate and open it for the guests by hand. Despite this, some guest was hearing the sound of the intercom and the gate was opening for them without our knowledge. There were many more strange things happening, but I don't want to bore you. One thing I can say, the longer we stayed and ignored it, the calmer the house was. When we were moving out, my mom asked this old neighbor if he would like to take our garden table and chairs, so he came to pick them. He gave us some backstory to this house. He asked why we were moving out, and my mom said that the house is not that great for us, and he answered, "Yep, I knew that you would not last for long." He said that none of the previous families stayed in it long, and they almost all had some family problems after a while. After a hesitation, he said that there was a murder in our pink home. 2 guys were holding a girl hostage. They did some things that I prefer not to mention. After hearing that, we were really glad that we left it behind. But not really. I think something has moved in with me. 4. My parents have owned a tavern and restaurant for 14 years in my small town. My father is someone who likes to start new projects, and is a well-known person in our town. One day he was contacted by the local realtor to offer my father a private showing of a historical hotel that had been up for sale. This hotel has been around for decades and went from hotel to restaurant to bar with little success. Everyone who had owned it before put it back on the market within a year. The bank had the title now, and the realtor told my father, "If you don't buy it and fix it up, they plan on ripping it down." A lot of people in the town thought the only person who could save it was my father, so he bought the hotel. My parents kept the downstairs bar and renovated the upstairs for apartments. That is when odd things started to happen. My father would come home almost every night with the camera footage to show my mom and I. The footage always showed an empty pool room with small random orbs floating in the foreground. My father is a believer in the paranormal and my mother is not, so her and I both chalked it up to bugs and dust. Although I will agree, the way the orbs zigzagged around the room was weird. It still seemed like nothing. A month goes by and my father comes home early on a Sunday from working down at the hotel. He walked in the house spooked, something my father rarely is. He detailed out how he was behind the bar checking on receipts from the night before, when he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway entrance. We don't open on Sunday, but if someone my dad knew saw his truck in the parking lot, they would just walk in to see him. So he didn't find the footsteps odd at all. Without looking up from his receipts, he called out, "We aren't open, but give me a second." He heard the footsteps enter the bar room and take 6 more steps toward him before stopping. Taking another second to finish going over last night's shift, he looks up and peers around the wooden support beam. And there is no one there. He said he got out of there so fast he doesn't even remember locking the door behind him. My mom obviously thinks he is crazy, but I'm freaked. That place had always given me the creeps, but my father confirming my fears made me never set foot in that building again. 2 days ago, my mom had an experience there that sent her out the door faster than my dad. She was in the bar room before opening hours collecting the shift money from the night before. She wasn't in there for more than 5 minutes before she started to hear the faint sound of music coming from the entrance hallway. She said she ignored it for a while, assuming it was one of the tenants upstairs. After collecting the money, she went to leave, and the music started getting louder. She said it sounded like old waltz music, piano-based, and it sounded clear as day. The further she walked down the hall toward the bathrooms, the more prominent the music became. As she stepped in front of the women's restroom, she said it sounded like someone was in there playing the music on their phone. By this time, my mom was sufficiently freaked out and ran out of rational reasoning behind what it could be. Just as she was about to open the door, she said she heard the water turn on and off twice before running out of the building. In the parking lot, she called my dad to come down, certain someone had been in there with her. But when he came down to check it out, no one was there. Now my mom is a believer, and we are both properly terrified of that old creepy hotel. I checked with my dad. He says it's okay to say the name. It's called the Broadway Hotel. 5. On December 12th of last year, me and my family moved into a new house. I was between my first and second semester of college when we moved, so I decided to take up a part-time position at a Christmas tree farm to get some extra cheese for the holiday. That pretty much meant I was never home. After a few days of actually living there, some things started happening. Now, I'm a lazy bastard. I didn't unpack for like another 2 months. In fact, I still have a box or two with clothes and other shit that I just haven't touched. Anyway, there were about a dozen boxes of various things sat inside my room. After a shift at the farm one night, I went to a buddy's house and spent the night and didn't get home till 2 p.m. the next day. So I was out of the house for over 24 hours. My mom was home alone decorating the living room when she started hearing boxes being thrown in my bedroom. She assumed I was finally unpacking, so she didn't think much of it. The throwing became more and more aggressive as time went by, so she eventually bust into my room to figure out what my malfunction was. Except all of the boxes were where I left them, and the room was empty. It was weird, but got weirder when my mom remembered that the guy who lived here several years ago hit his off switch in the house on Christmas Eve. We had to do a lot of work on the home before we moved in, so it had been almost 2 months before we actually moved in, which is why it slipped my mother's mind that the guy died. I think his name was either Billy or Bobby. Something you name your kid that sounds good on a kid, but becomes odd when the kid turns 30. Anyway, turns out he offed himself in my bedroom. It didn't bother me, really, and I figured if he's gonna haunt me, it's cool as long as he sticks to throwing boxes and doesn't actually mess with me. A day or two passes, and I'm in my bedroom unpacking, when I hear this loud crash and glass shattering. So I run downstairs to see what happened and make sure everyone is okay, and I see my parents just sitting on the couch. I asked what happened. My mom just sort of gestures to the floor and said the clock fell. I looked, and sure enough, the clock we had on the wall had fallen off and broke. She said not to worry about it, and that she'd clean it in a minute. At first glance, I thought that the screw I had planted in the wall to hang it had stripped out, but it didn't sit right with me. So I checked it out, and the screw was still in the damn wall. I had to plant it to a stud in the wall with a really long screw so it didn't pry itself out. The clock is stupid heavy because it was a big decorative piece made of metal, and the place you hang it on is one of those little keyhole things in the back of it that you slide over the screw or nail to prevent it from falling. This clock definitely could not have fallen off the wall on its own, but my folks said that it had. The last encounter I personally had was definitely lackluster in comparison to the others. I was home alone, and my dog was following me around to steal my sandwich. She's a 3-pound toy Yorkie poo, and despite giving everyone in the house grief for wanting this dog, I like her enough to spoil her when nobody's looking. So I bent down to give her a little scrap of turkey, when she started freaking the fuck out. While I'm trying to calm her down, I hear this tapping on the stove. We have a cookie jar that we recycle to use as our cookingware container that sits between the 2 eyes of the stove. I look at it, and it's gently rattling, but I figured it was just something that happened in the house that I hadn't caught, like perhaps the AC kicking on and shaking it a bit or something. It just didn't bother me at first, till it started getting more and more aggressive until I thought the jar was going to explode or something. But before it could, everything went silent. No rattles, no barking. I even realized I started holding my breath. The next day was Christmas Eve, and I was expecting the house to implode, but it didn't. Nothing happened in the house after that, until early this morning, which reminded me of all that shit. Nothing big happened, but I got off my shift at about 11, and I went to bed at about 1. I was asleep for maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours when my dog starts flipping shit in the hallway. I get up and look out in the hallway and I don't see anything. My younger brother wakes up and peeks out with me, and he asks what's going on. We've had some issues with trespassing before, so I got very defensive of the house, and sent my brother back to his room so I could take a look. I flip on the hallway light and there's nothing there, but my dog is still panicking like her life is about to end. My parents' room is downstairs in the basement, so they didn't really catch wind of this till the next day when I tell them. I start to panic, and I'm flipping on every light to every room, searching for anyone there. And all of a sudden she stops barking. No calming down, just ceases. It reminds me of the cookie jar, and I was relieved for about 2 seconds, because I knew, oh my god, nobody was in the house. But I don't like the idea of this old dude lingering around again, now that it's getting closer to Christmas. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 166. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I just want to give a quick shout out to me, because I haven't had one for a while. I'm pretty awesome. Pat myself in the back. Well, specifically I want to give a shout out to the description of my videos. I'm aware that a lot of people have trouble finding it. Right underneath. Just hit where it says show more if you're on mobile. There'll be a little arrow, a little pointed out arrow, next to the title. Just pop that while making a booping sound, you go boop, and then that will show you the description. And that's where all the good and awesome stuff is, like Twitter links, Patreon links, the most important one probably the email link, if you want to send me stories or your grandma's cookie recipe, that sort of thing. And that's the place to send it. And there is a Discord server which I continually forget to link. I'm not actually sure if I'm allowed to link it in every video, but well, with that I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.